Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is surgeon and pilot Dr. Kenneth Stahl. He talks about decision-making, aging gracefully, and what pilots can learn from doctors. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hi everyone, I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporties. Visit sporties.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our complete archives. And remember, you can send us an email with your comments, questions, and guest ideas at podcast@sporties.com. Today, my guest is Dr. Kenneth Stahl, a man with many achievements in both the operating room and the cockpit. He is board certified in cardiac surgery and trauma surgery and has worked with both AOPA's Board of Aviation Medical Advisors and the FAA's Aeromedical Innovation and Modernization Board. Dr. Stahl is also a very accomplished pilot with an ATP certificate and thousands of hours in his logbook. In his writings on aviation, he has a wonderful way of addressing deep questions about human performance from different angles. So today we'll be talking about aviation, medicine, and how they intersect. Ken, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Well, thank you. That was a very generous introduction.
You've written many articles for AOPA on traditional health topics like diet, exercise, heart disease, but I've heard you say that your favorite topic is actually metacognition. So tell us what that is and why it matters for pilots.
Well, sure. It comes back to some work I did with the U.S. Marine aviators in Yuma, Arizona at the MOTS. And the commanding general for that service had a lot of planes falling out of the sky. And he brought a bunch of people together and put us in a room and said, guys, I've got extremely experienced pilots with multiple thousands of hours. They're have totally clean records, but we're losing airplanes and losing our pilots. And before you get out of this room, I want you to tell me why really well-experienced advanced aviators seem to do stupid things. So a number of us kicked things around, and what it came down to was basically decision-making. And we really analyzed very deeply a lot of their accidents, and there was multiple aspects to that. It was partly that pilots didn't quite understand how they make decisions. The dark side of making decisions, obviously, is making bad ones and causing incidents, or even worse, causing accidents. And I got very interested in that whole topic. And you mentioned a little bit at the outset about the crossover between being a pilot and being a heart surgeon and a trauma surgeon. And the vocabulary is different. Obviously the hand skills are different, but the similarities in exactly what you described in metacognition, which is thinking about how we think about things. And there's no difference in the decision-making process, whether it's in the operating room or the cockpit. It's the same brain. We process information the same way. And in order to have good outcomes, you have to process that information properly and come up with a correct solution to what is confronting you. So a lot of what I've written about is the decision-making process. And we make decisions on a continuum from really hair on fire emergency decisions all the way to time unconstrained decisions that we can think about as much as we want. And what the physiology of decision making in our brain is that when we have lots of time, we use the frontal part of our brain, the frontal cortex, where we store all our knowledge, all our training, all our experience. When we have time to make a decision, we run the information through that part of our brain, that part of our thinking process, and generally come up with a good answer. The big problem flying jets and being a trauma surgeon confronted with patients who are severely acutely injured and near life-threatening injuries is that you don't have all that time. And all the catecholamines in our brain, we know what it feels like to be acutely stressed. All the butterflies in our stomach are just cortisol and epinephrine and adrenaline that cause little bit of muscle twitches in our muscles, in our diaphragm, that bypasses that front part, the frontal cortex, where all that knowledge is, and sends the information to the central part of our brain called the limbic system, which is the emotional brain. And that's where the whole fight or flight response lives. So the key is, how do you make time compressed decisions correctly when you're really bypassing so much of your training information, your knowledge, and your experience to come up with a very quick answer. That's the essence of metacognition, thinking about how we think about things, how we process information and come up with answers to questions and problems.
So if I were to radically simplify things, I would say there's sort of two schools of thought here. There's the Daniel Kahneman school. His book, Thinking Fast and Slow, was very popular a few years ago. This concept of system one, which is sort of fast and kind of inaccurate, that more emotional side. And then there's system two, which is slow and more thoughtful. But then there's other authors like Gerd Gigerenzer and others who've written books saying, hey, wait a minute, system one isn't so bad, actually. And we use these heuristics that when you are under time pressure can work pretty well. So which side of that do you come down on?
So I'm very fascinated with this topic of heuristic decision making. And pilots actually know more about this than they know, because neuroscientists have hung a whole lot of vocabulary around it with a lot of syllables that, they're designed to make it confusing for people so they seem very special. But heuristics is really, for a pilot, it's situational awareness. And what it does is it takes, the three pots of information for situational awareness is what happened 5 minutes ago, what's going on right now, and what can I do about it to have a good outcome in 5 minutes. And heuristics is dissecting that. And I've thought about this a fair amount, and I probably come down someplace in the middle. I think the problem with the limbic system decisions and really the rapid response is you tend to do anything. And the first inclination isn't necessarily the right thing. I had learned to fly a long time ago, and some of the instructors that I had always said, when something bad happens, wind the clock. Well, pilots and airplanes and cockpit panels no longer have wind-up clocks. But just just doing almost nothing for a moment really is clearing your thinking process. And all of us have wonderful mothers who've told us, just take a deep breath and relax. There's some science behind that. When you take a deep breath, not only does air come into your lungs, but blood comes into your chest. And our lungs have a huge capillary bed. I mean, the surface area of our lungs is almost that of a tennis court. And when there's cellular mechanisms within the capillaries of the lung with another fancy name with a lot of syllables. It's called the reticuloendothelial system. And what that does is that metabolizes some of those acute stress hormones. So, I've thought and taught a lot about this in the operating room and to pilots, but that just simply taking a moment to take a deep breath, not only does it give you a moment to attain clarity, it actually blows some of those stress hormones out of your brain. And those stress hormones have multiple effects on your thinking process. And that's probably what drives decisions from your thinking, from your cortical thought process to your emotional brain. Those stress hormones sit in the little spaces between the nerves, and a name for that, the synapses. And the neurotransmitters that pass information from one nerve to the next usually are metabolized quickly by some hormones that sit, some enzymes and hormones that sit within that little microspace. But one of the effects of the catecholamines is it inhibits the metabolism of those transmitter chemicals. So those things just bounce around back and forth. And we've all experienced that. When something acutely stressful is happening, the sound ratchets up, and just things seem to go by so quickly. And even if you listen to a football broadcast, they always say, well, the game is going too fast for this young player. And really all that is his inability to process the information with a clear thinking process. So I'm kind of in the middle. I've come up with some ways um, to mitigate a little bit of that stress process. And it goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years, with meditation, and some of this information is generated with EEG recordings. That's recording the electrical activity of your brain. And when there's an acute stress response, we drive these alpha waves across our brain, and just you can watch it on an EEG. That someone who can relax, who can blow some of those stress hormones out of their thought circuits in their brain, can actually see them converting alpha waves to beta waves, which are more organized, slower and larger in amplitude. And that's really where the thinking process comes. So there's nothing wrong with emergency emotional decisions, as long as you do have the ability to kind of blend the knowledge you have with the reflexes. And simply doing something reflexively sometimes gets you into more trouble. And I think that the pilot lesson, the operating room lesson, the trauma surgeon lesson is just don't do something stupid right away, because that is often going to make the situation worse. And a pilot's or a surgeon's ability to mitigate that stress response is really one of the keys in the heuristics and the metacognition models to making good decisions in the air and on the ground, in the operating room and in the emergency room.
Do you think we can teach good decision making to pilots, or is this something you just have to learn from experience?
Absolutely. I mean, we have good statistics on that. I mean, after all the work we did in Yuma with the Marine Aviators War Tactics School, we reduced the mishap rate in that wing by 60%. So there are a lot of ways to make good decisions. I spent a fair amount of time trying to understand the decision-making processes we've spoken about over the last few minutes. And I think if you understand how you make good decisions and the realization that the dark side of decisions are bad ones, you can make much better decisions when you have to. When you have all the time to make a thought-out decision, that's an easy process. I mean, obviously you need skills and knowledge and have to be well trained, but that's exactly the point that General Davis made with us in Arizona. Was my pilots are good, they're experienced, they're well trained, and they're still doing stupid things. Tell me why and what I can do to prevent that.
So we've been talking about the brain a lot here and how important thinking is. That suggests to me that keeping our brain healthy is really important for flying safely. And you wrote a great article last year in which you said, stopping the dopamine train we're on in the madness of our current existence is a great idea. Healthy too. And I love your phrase, the dopamine train there. What does that mean? And give us an example of how we can fight that.
Sure. I didn't invent it. I just read about it and agreed with it. So there's a concept in psychology called a dopamine holiday. And dopamine does multiple things to you. It's essentially one of the feel-good chemicals that circulate in our brain. But the problem is that, and I think our society is in a sense a bit going in the wrong direction, where people spend hours and hours and hours on social media. You virtually can't see anybody without a cell phone in front of them, who are texting or looking at movies or playing games. And all those things, unfortunately, were actually designed to be somewhat addictive. And the way it's addictive is it causes release of dopamine. And in that article you're quoting, I spent some time with the head of the Stanford Department of Psychology, who has written she's a wonderful woman and was very, very helpful. She's written books on this whole concept of the dopamine holiday. And the reason it's healthy is because you have to separate that feel good, which is almost an artificial sensation, that social media, cell phone generated feel good sensation, from reality. And people, I believe, are almost living in an artificial reality that's been generated by video games and endless Netflix, and all of which is good in moderation, but it's not. It doesn't contribute to the maturation of our thinking process, which, that's just another word for training and learning, and it's just putting stuff up there in the front of our brain where it can be accessed to make good decisions. Taking care of your brain, and there's that old kiddie song about the hip bone is connected to the knee bone and such. The fact of the matter is we go around this planet in one little envelope of our body, and everything is connected. So anything that is healthy for your heart health, your diet health, all of those activities really enhance the clarity of your thinking process. And there are algorithms for how much you should walk. I noticed an article in the medical literature this weekend about how keeping track of the number of steps in a day should be the sixth vital sign. And, all those things are just ways of saying that everything is connected. Exercise generates things in your brain that aren't necessarily dopamine related, they're endorphin related. And endorphins are, I know a bit about it because I went through an MD PhD program in medical school, and the research I did was in neurochemistry, and our lab actually named the endorphin for what it was. It used to be called, when it was first discovered, the endogenous morphine-like substance, because it actually binds to morphine receptors. And one day we were looking at each other and saying, well, that's just way too many syllables for me. So we shortened to endorphin, which is, as I've said, endogenous morphine-like substance. But that binds with what is also an addictive part of your brain, the morphine receptors. But things that are generally healthy, exercise, good diet, that pleasure can be generated with endorphins and not necessarily with just pure dopamine, which is, as I said, the general feel-good chemical. The downside of the feel-good chemicals is, frankly, it also kind of the lazy chemical. And the more people do nothing but sit in front of their social media accounts and their cell phone accounts and play video games and don't get outside and lead what we all intuitively know is a healthy lifestyle, get some exercise, get some fresh air, and just let your brain go into a resting state, which is the dopamine holiday that you referred to. Sleep is very important for a lot of reasons, but one of the things sleep does is that resting state of your brain is when we store things that we've learned through the day. And if you really don't give your brain a chance to relax and to get into a mode where you have ability to codify all the knowledge and training that you've spent the day working on, it just doesn't get stored. So all those wrap around the first topic you mentioned about decision-making and thinking, and is a basis for just the information we need to make good decisions.
A related topic here is one that's been in the news a lot with pilots, and that relates to aging pilots. It's received a lot of attention around the insurance market, but just from a broader standpoint of judging my skills as a pilot, how should an older pilot, what should they be doing to monitor their performance? I mean, certainly the healthy lifestyle stuff you mentioned is very important, but from a flying skills and decision-making process, what should an older pilot be doing to monitor their performance?
Well, that's a great question. I wrote a little article on that a while back. You know, that one thing that's very common that I like to make the analogy between flying skills and driving skills. There are states, a number of them, probably about 15 or 20 states, and they by law require retesting. In other words, another driving test on pilots over a certain age, and it ranges, I think, starting around 80 or 75. Things don't always get processed very quickly as we get older. Certainly our reflexes slow down. There are all kinds of medical conditions to think about. But one thing I would do, although we don't require just a medical, and we do require biannuals, but I would do a lot of flying, and I've done this with friends who are more advanced in years, although aging is all relative. But I would fly with an instructor, or at least an experienced pilot. And one of my surgical partners was very senior to me, but had been a Navy pilot and owned some nice airplanes. And every 6 months he said, "Come fly with me." And he'd fly approaches, fly under the hood, and say, "Am I okay?" And I'd say, "You're ahead of the airplane. You're doing fine." But if you start having driving accidents, or start forgetting where you put something, or open the freezer and see you put your mail in there that you collected in the day, there has to be some self-policing. And the problem we face in general aviation, and there's a famous quote from the ancient Greek general. I can't quote it in Greek or Latin, but it was, "Who will guard the guardians?" And that's an important topic, because as general aviation pilots, we're generally the only pilot in the airplane. So you have to be a self-guardian, and that takes insight to yourself and honesty with yourself. And, another vocabulary, we talked a bit about situational awareness and tried to dissect that into another vocabulary. Another thing is crew resource management. And single pilot crew resource management is another topic I've become interested in, because there is no crew. And crew resource management for a single pilot, I like to think of as managing all the voices in your head. And you have to make yourself listen to that little voice in the back of your head. And sometimes the hardest voice to hear is that little voice saying, don't do that, or you should do this and not that. It's very easy to ignore that little voice, but you have to give that voice authority. And when that little voice is telling you there's something not quite right, you have to train your brain to listen to it. And I would say that aging pilots not only face all the problems of an aging body, of thinking, of reflexes, of strength, of resilience, and they also face a little bit of the ability to process that kind of self-introspection. And you can provide external evaluations by flying with instructors, and you really should do that. But the harder thing is when that little voice is telling you, I'm just not comfortable anymore. That's really hard to pay attention to. And if you don't hear it and don't listen to it and don't let it, give you important advice, I believe that's one way elderly pilots get themselves into trouble.
Ken, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with some more questions.
As a pilot, You know continuous learning is the key, but who has time for boring study sessions? Over 200,000 pilots skip the dry reading and subscribe to the free Pilot's Tip of the Week from Pilot Workshops. Every Wednesday, you get 2 minutes or less of practical advice from top experts. We cover everything from airmanship and IFR to weather and emergencies. These lessons instantly build your confidence and proficiency. Plus, you get useful videos and downloads with every tip. Become a safer pilot this week. Sign up now at pilotworkshops.com/tip. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Dr. Kenneth Stahl, who has done a lot of work to apply the principles of aviation safety to medicine, and I suspect the other way around. Now, Ken, I know that the best pilots in my life religiously debrief their flights and they think about how to get better the next time they go flying. They review the data from their flight if they can. How do you do that as a surgeon? Is there a formal debrief process after an operation? Do you watch a video? Do you take notes?
All of the above. And it's a very important topic. The more, and there's data out on that taking videos of resuscitations of trauma patients or emergency situations, for example, patient who suffered a cardiac arrest, and then sit around and look at the video is very important. But there's some important principles of that. You should use debriefs to generate light, not heat. And by that, I mean, you should shine a bright light on what went right, what went wrong, what you could have done differently, what you did well and you want to repeat. But it should never be a blame game. And even when things don't go all that well, trying to cast blame it doesn't foster any knowledge of how to manage the situation better. And being triple board certified in surgery, I have to recertify, and unfortunately, that's fairly common. And I just took my trauma surgery critical care boards again, and one of the questions was actually on this whole data field of videotaping resuscitations, whether they're, as I said, an acutely injured bleeding patient or cardiac arrest, but there's a lot of data on putting cameras in emergency rooms and in the trauma bays and the resuscitation areas and sit around and debrief. And, it's always brief the flight, fly the brief, and debrief it. And it's the same in the operating room. You can really learn a whole lot about how things have gone by just watching how you did. And it also, we talk again, before the break, we were chatting a bit about crew resource management. Crew resource management it's a complex concept that involves a lot of things, but certainly it's enabling everybody to contribute. I remember it was middle of the night, one night I was in the operating room with a patient who had multiple gunshot wounds and doing horribly. And we had the surgical field exposed, and I kept saying, there's no more bleeding. Why is this patient dying? And there was this very small Asian, very shy, very new third-year medical student who was rotating through trauma. And it was like a little mouse in the corner. She said, there's something dripping on my feet here. And as a leader of the surgical team, as the lead surgeon, or even in the cockpit, if you simply say at the beginning, hey, anyone can say anything they're concerned about, just speak up. And that's certainly a principle of crew resource management. So me and the anesthesiologist pulled the drape back and saw that they had put a huge intravenous in the vein here in the top of the chest. It's very standard to resuscitate in a patient who's bleeding to death, so you can replace a lot of volume quickly. And what was happening was that IV had become disconnected. And everything the anesthesiologists were giving was just running on the floor. And unfortunately, the patient was bleeding out the back end of that large cannula, that large size cannula. And if this little woman hadn't said something, and all of us on the team hadn't enabled that for her to talk up, and hadn't listened to this little chirpy voice, I mean, certainly it was the critical information that frankly saved the patient's life. So if you don't take a video and debrief all those little things, if you took a video and realized someone was trying to say something and you just weren't going to listen to it, or didn't think a third-year medical student really had any standing to comment about such a dire situation, and we could have lost the patient to something as simple as a disconnected IV. So, the value of these videos is just that, is to look at those sorts of things. Did you, no matter how dire the situation, I mean, I so often said, hey, you see something, say it, just get someone's attention. And it's the same in the cockpit. I mean, a foreign carrier, it's common knowledge. I mean, I'm not saying anything that's disrespectful, but Korea had a lot of accidents. And it turned out that it was really a social problem, is that the captain was actually enabled to just reach around and swat the first officer if they said something they didn't know. And by looking at cockpit voice recorders, the traditional way of looking at an aviation accident, which is exactly as you said, the debrief. I mean, there were literally the first officer didn't say anything out of spite, and there were a number of Korean Air accidents, to the point where the government of Korea flew on Japan Airlines. They wouldn't even use Korean Airlines. And they hired our flight aviation experts. And the first thing they did was prohibit speaking Korean in the cockpit, because the language was so socially designed for superiority. It really wasn't designed for teams. So all of those factors play into the reason it's so important to have these debriefs. And in the hospital, it's privileged information. Obviously, you can never disclose any of that outside of the hospital, but we debrief those all the time.
Yeah, so many crossovers there between medicine and flying. Crew resource management, debriefs, checklists, when the stakes are high and teamwork's involved.
Oh, absolutely.
It's critical.
That speaks to your first point, is, what are the similarities between having an airline pilot's license and a surgeon's license is just the decision making. We have one brain. As I said at the outset, obviously the vocabulary is different, but we process information and make decisions the same. So clearly the crossover is just the topic today, decision making.
Ken, we always close the show with a lightning round we call Ready to Copy. I'll ask some rapid fire questions on a wide range of topics, and you read back with your quick answer. You ready to copy?
Good to go. Do
doctors generally make good or bad pilots?
Well, I wrote a whole piece on that. I think that the rap doctors have as bad pilots is the fact that a lot of doctors have more money than brains. Frankly, they can afford big, powerful airplanes. The whole V-tailed bonanza that used to be called the fork-tailed doctor killer. I think it was because doctors spent a lot on high-end equipment and never learned how to fly it properly. Plus, I think doctors just are used to being in charge and making bold decisions, and they have to be a student. As another one of my instructors said, you're always a student in the cockpit. And I would just bounce that back to say, I don't have a license to be a doctor. I only have a license to practice medicine.
What is the simplest advice you would give someone who wants to live a healthier lifestyle? What's an easy one?
Eat right, get some exercise, mostly common sense things. I think you can spend half your paycheck on all these, stuff that's advertised over the counter, and, take this pill and you'll think better, take this pill and it's, frankly, I'm not a big believer in that. I think the answer is design for yourself a program of eating right, of managing your weight, managing your blood pressure, get some exercise, and take a break from it. Take that dopamine holiday to let your brain consolidate all the information and have a period of relaxation.
You've written, quote, "Be careful what you put into your tanks." So what is something I should never put into my tanks? And we're talking about the body here, not my airplane.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Well, I'm also kind of a realist and a believer in moderation. No matter what you put in your body, in excess can hurt you. And, frankly, I'm not going to say a glass or two of wine after dinner with your wife a couple of times a week is going to really inflict any harm on you. Obviously, a lot of things to excess are bad for you. Certainly, there's a lot of chemicals you can put in your body. I know this whole marijuana thing has gotten a lot of attention. The chemical in marijuana that causes all the buzz is THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. The THC from, obviously before your generation, but my high school or college days had about 3 to 5% THC in the average whatever unit of joint or ounce or whatever the measuring was. Now it's up to around 90%. So you don't have to take, you can say, well, I'm just going to smoke this once in a while. You're actually taking probably 90% more of that chemical than you were before. There's just a whole lot of bad things you can put in your body. I think in moderation, though, you can manage it. But I would just go with my earlier statement. I mean, live a healthy lifestyle, and a lot of that is common sense.
What is a minor health condition or a seemingly minor health condition that's actually a big deal for an FA medical? Something I should not hide from my AME?
Yeah. Well, everything's a minor condition in someone else, but in you, it's a major condition. So one of the things we've done with the AOPA, and I've been involved with the FAA, is pilots tend to avoid some medical contacts because they don't want things on their medical record. I mean, the FAA has the authority to look at your pharmacy records. There's a lot of undertreatment that's been come to light lately in attention deficit disorder. I know that autism has supposedly gone from a couple of incidences per 1,000 to sometimes as much as 1 or 2 out of 20 or 30. Some of that is we diagnose it differently. Some of that I think is environmental, has been out in the public press. But failure to treat what is really can be debilitating, attention deficit disorder, even depression. That's a big deal, and I think that the FAA, it's that old thing, as Ronald Reagan said, the worst words in the English language is "we're from the government and we're here to help." But if pilots deny medical conditions because they want to keep their pilot's license, they're doing themselves significant harm. And I know there are I have an airline pilot's license. I don't make any money from flying, but obviously there are a lot of people whose lives and livelihood depend on it. But the most important thing is your health. And if you ever put your health behind your occupation, you're going to do yourself harm.
I know you've done a lot of work with robotic-assisted surgery. Have you learned any lessons there that might apply to pilots as they use increasingly sophisticated automation in the cockpit? Any transfer there?
Yeah. Well, I hate to date myself and quote Ronald Reagan once again, but when he was dealing with the Russians, a reporter asked him how he was going to handle this, whether he could ever trust the Russians. And he said, yeah, trust but verify. So one of the common causes of accidents is automation bias. As a matter of fact, the article that's going to hit the wires next week on the 1st of the month is about automation bias and how this whole artificial intelligence has taken over so many of the things that we used to do. And I think it's fine, as I got up in my ratings into the airline pilot world, they always say, fly the airplane at the highest degree of automation you can. But you can never turn over your decision-making, our topic of the day. You can never not supervise the autopilot, and you can never assume it's right. Frankly, I don't know if I was just born as a skeptic, but I kind of assume everything is always wrong till I can confirm it myself. I think the worst mistake pilots can make with automation is not verifying it. Trust it fine, when you're in snarky weather and the clouds bouncing around, I'm all fine with the autopilot, but I'd never take my hand off the yoke, and I'm always willing to push that disconnect button and hand fly the airplane if things don't look like they're going well. There's so many famous accidents. I'm off to Brazil, as I said, tomorrow to talk to their FAA. There's a really famous accident about it was American Airlines Flight 956 that was flying through a long valley over Colombia in the Andes, and Cali approach cleared them to the outer marker straight in for an approach. And they dialed in R for the identifier of the outer marker, but the waypoints were listed in alphabetical order, and they didn't realize that the flight management system selected Romeo, not Revo, which was the outer marker, and Romeo was due east of their position, so it turned the plane to the east, and when they realized they weren't straight in and doing the right thing, they dialed in the correct identifier. The plane turned towards Cali. The problem is they never disconnected the autopilot, which was in the descent mode with the slats and flaps deploying, and they were no longer in the valley. They were over the Andes peaks, and they flew the airplane into the side of a mountain, and somehow 2 or 3 people survived that, but it was a total tragedy. And the whole thing was because the pilots, fine, use the automation, but don't turn you can never abrogate, and you can never turn your decision-making authority and your responsibility over to the automation.
As a surgeon, what's your favorite question to hear from a patient?
Well, that's the most common one is what's my chances, which is probably my least favorite. And, I always tell patients statistics only apply to populations, not individuals. I think the best question to hear is, what can I do to get over this? How can I help myself? And, I basically do heart surgery. In my trauma surgery life, I would say, don't play with guns and don't put yourself in dangerous situations. I think a lot of the best questions are about preventative medicine. What can I do to prevent getting too sick? If I am sick, what can I do to help myself to improve my lifestyle, whether it's a healthy diet or whatever the particulars are? But certainly, I think buy-in on the part of the patient to their own health is the most important. I mean, I would never touch with a 100-foot scalpel a patient who says, "Hey, doc, do what you want. I'm going to die anyway." Because I think that patients who really haven't invested in their own survival don't do well.
I know you're a fan of Lawrence Gonzalez. What's his best book? Which one should I start with?
I think Deep Survival is his best book. And part of it is the subtitle to Deep Survival is Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. And it's basically, I think it's about 10 or 12 chapters, and each one is another incident. And it's fascinating because he'll look at a lifeboat full of people who managed to survive sinking of a big ship, and half the people lived and half the people died. And it's a perfect control experiment, and he analyzes why the people who survived did. And, a lot of, there's just a lot of self-inflicted wounds in this world. Unfortunately, people, play stupid games, they win stupid prizes. But, why people survive critical situations, I love that whole concept. I mean, certainly, the Arctic, these Arctic missions, the sinking of the Endurance and Ernest Shackleton, he didn't lose a single crew member, and there's so many good stories. I was very fortunate to visit Antarctica last year. It was the last continent I hadn't explored, and we sailed right over where his ship, the Endurance, had sunk, and it had just been discovered by a team from Chile a few months before we went there. And just that whole tale of survival is so fascinating. I mean, some people are just, they're just too obstinate to die. And Lawrence Gonzalez really nails what's going on in our head, in our bodies, in our thought process, our thinking process of why some people live through situations that others never survive.
Our last question is always the same. You have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Oh, I don't know. I kind of like that TBM 900 they just came out with, and that's a good question. Where would I go? I don't know. I would probably one flight I'd like to take is I'd like to ferry a TBM from France, where they're manufactured, back to the United States. There's been some really cool stuff written about that. I've been in Iceland, and just the thought of approaching into Reykjavik and in the fog and the ice, and it's such a cool place with all those volcanoes. And I just think flying across the Atlantic in a little plane like that, relatively, I mean, it's not little, it's a gorgeous airplane. But I think that would probably be the ultimate flight for me.
Ken, thanks for being on the podcast.
It's all my pleasure. It's so it's always nice to share some thoughts, and hopefully somebody will hear it and maybe they'll not make a little mistake that they might not have avoided without thinking about some of the topics that we've covered.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sporties.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.